This lecture is going to talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson and the movement we now know as Transcendentalism. So make sure that you have a paper and pencil ready so that you can take notes. Please feel free to pause the video so that you can read through slides or take notes on the slides. And if you have any questions, don't forget you can always reach out to me later. So during this lecture, we're going to focus on the writer and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. He is one of the most important authors in antebellum American literature, and possibly just in American literature because of the effect that he had. So we'll begin by talking about his life, and we'll be putting his life in context with other writers and ideas at the time. Then I'll dive in to highlight some important aspects about his work. Specifically, we'll be talking about our assigned readings. We're going to start with nature, even though you aren't necessarily reading that as an assigned reading, but then we'll talk about self-reliance and the American scholar. Finally, we'll finish up by discussing the impact of Emerson's influence on writers of his time and beyond. I really can't overstate how important Emerson is to kind of establishing a distinctly new and different version of literature that's going to become the national literature. So hopefully by the end, you'll have a solid understanding of some of the big ideas you're going to focus on as you read his work. I'll give you a heads up, his stuff can be dense. His prose is very, very kind of twisting and almost poetic. So sometimes it can be a struggle for readers who are not used to it. So what I'm going to do in this video is kind of give you an overview of the big ideas. So when you see them in your readings, you'll be able to be like, aha, that's what I'm supposed to be looking for. So Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson is the child of a Unitarian minister. He was born in 1803, and his father died when Emerson was only 8 years old. So from there, his mother wanted to send him and his 4 brothers to Harvard so that they could follow in their father's footsteps and become ministers themselves. At Harvard, Emerson was a thoroughly average student. He graduated pretty much right in the middle of his class of 59 in 1821. And after he graduated, he spent a few years as a thoroughly average schoolmaster in a number of Boston area schools. He goes back to Harvard for divinity school in 1825. And in 1829, he became a Unitarian minister, a pastor in the Unitarian Church. So in the 1820s in Boston, Unitarianism is a very secularized version of Christianity. Many Unitarians in that area at that time had deeply skeptical beliefs about the Bible's ability to save humans, about salvation, even about the divinity of Jesus Christ. Now, Emerson was influenced by some of these thinkers. He was part of this larger movement, and he was also influenced by a vein of German criticism, which regarded the Judeo-Christian Bible as a document produced in a specific historical time, rather than as the direct word from God. So these things together, Emerson gradually developed a greater faith in the individual moral settlement, the man himself, and a man's intuition, rather than in revealed religion. His intellectual skepticism towards religion, combined with the personal crisis of his wife's death at the age of 19 after only 2 years of marriage, led Emerson to resign his position as a pastor and to go to Europe. So he leaves for Europe in 1832 on Christmas Day, and he does not return for an entire year. And while in Europe, he is going to have a number of experiences. In fact, part of those experiences are meeting with a number of very well-known British writers who will later influence his intellectual development. And these writers include really famous poets like Samuel Coleridge and William Wordsworth. In 1833, Emerson returns to America and decides to become a public lecturer. Now, 2 factors contribute to Emerson's career transition from Unitarian minister to lecturer and author. The first one, as I said before, is his disillusionment with religion. And his tour of Europe really pointed him in a new intellectual direction. The second, though, was that he finally got his inheritance from his first wife's legacy. This assured him of an annual income of more than $1,000, which at the time was an enormous sum of money. This freed him to pursue a career as an author. He didn't have to go to work. So I really can't kind of overstate how important his wife's money is for him at this time. If you remember the earlier lecture about the historical context of antebellum America, think about the publication of American books and how expensive they were and how tricky they were to get published without international copyright protections. Like many authors after him, Emerson's partner's income, in this case his deceased wife's income, is going to be instrumental in allowing him to pursue the life of thinking and writing that made him famous, and it really began a movement in American philosophy that influences us to this day. In 1835, Emerson marries Lydia Jackson, and together they move to Concord, Massachusetts, where he's a part of a community of intellectuals and writers that include really famous people like Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote The Scarlet Letter and a bunch of other short stories, Margaret Fuller, and the famous poet Henry Wordsworth Longfellow. In Concord, Massachusetts, he completed his first book called Nature, and that was published the following year in 1836. Now, nature is a complex mix of philosophy, personal reflection, world history, and ethics. The book was hugely important because it served as a touchstone for a small group of like-minded individuals in the Boston and Concord area who would become known as the Transcendentalists. This Transcendentalist group was composed mainly of ministers who had rejected the view of philosopher John Locke. If you remember an earlier lecture, we talked about John Locke and his idea that the mind was merely this passive receptor of sense. You started as a tabula rasa, and then through sense and impression, you just kind of became what you were going to become based on your surroundings. Instead, Transcendentalists endorsed something closer to Samuel Coleridge's and other romantics' alternative conception of the mind. The mind is not a blank slate that is passively receiving, but it's an actively intuitive and creative force that can actually act upon the world. So let's take a moment before we dig into Emerson to talk a little bit about Transcendentalism and what it is and why it's important for Emerson and also for the understanding of Whitman and some of the other writers we're going to be looking at. So part of the reason that Emerson and his work is so essential to American history and literature is because it was part of a larger community of writers and thinkers known as these Transcendentalists. Now, the name now belongs to a major school of thought in American literature, but it actually wasn't chosen by the group. In fact, the name Transcendentalist was a label that was intended to mock the group, but they took it on, they made it their own, and the rest is history. So Transcendentalism is a philosophical, spiritual, and literary movement developed specifically in this New England region. Their core belief, one of their core beliefs, is in the inherent goodness of people and nature. And Transcendentalists also believed that while society and its institutions had corrupted the purity of the individual, they believed that people are always at their best when truly self-reliant and independent. Transcendentalists saw divine experiences inherent in the everyday. We're going to see that over and over. Rather than believing in a distant heaven, they see that all is one, that a blade of grass contains heaven within it. For them, the physical and spiritual phenomenon are not separate. They're part of a dynamic process, part of the same process. So Transcendentalism is important in part because it was one of the first philosophical currents that emerged in the United States. Taking its cue from Romanticism, the movement emphasized subjective intuition over objective empiricism. So here we see that reaction against Enlightenment thinking, right? Its adherents believed that individuals were capable of generating completely original insights with little attention and deference to past masters. This idea of almost radical independence, a throwing off of the past, that should really resonate with you, especially when you consider that the movement had its rise after the final victories of the War of 1812. Just as America has thrown off its past masters of Britain, the Transcendentalists are not interested in looking to the past for answers. Instead, they're interested in looking within. So as I said, this is closely related to Unitarianism. It comes out of communities where Unitarian beliefs were kind of the model, but it's not so much a rejection of the Unitarianism religion. Instead, it's kind of a consequence, kind of an organic outgrowth. Unitarians emphasized free consciousness and the value of intellectual reason, and Transcendentalists are going to take those ideals and run with them. But the Transcendentalists were not content with the sobriety, mildness, and calm rationalism of Unitarian. They wanted something more intensely spiritual. And if you remember our earlier lecture about Romanticism, this should sound a little bit familiar. Just as Romantics wanted kind of a heightened emotional experience, Transcendentalism wanted that as well. So in 1836, an actual club was founded in Cambridge, Massachusetts, making a point where the loosely organized community of writers and thinkers were a formalized movement. This included famous writers such as Margaret Fuller, Elizabeth Peabody, Henry David Thoreau, whose Walden is really famous, Charles Scemes Wheeler. In 1840, the club started to publish a magazine. We talked earlier about how magazines were really important for the literary culture, but just also for people's entertainment at this time. But the Dial is going to be a hugely important publication because it lasts for a really long time. It's going to be kind of on the forefront of some of the most important movements in American art, philosophy, and literature. So when we get to the period after World War I and the beginnings of modernism in a few weeks, Dial magazine is going to pop up again. You're going to see that some of the most important modernist poets and their works were published in those pages. And that again is traced all the way back to Emerson and his influence. So we aren't specifically going to be reading nature for our class this semester, but I do want to briefly go over some of the main themes and ideas of this important work, because much of what we see in Emerson's first book, Nature, gets repeated and further developed in his later works. So again, please feel free to pause the video for a second so that you can read through some of these quotes or take notes. Don't feel like you have to rush through. So this first quotation comes from the introduction to Nature, and it's a great starting point to really get our heads around Emerson's ideas. In this passage, Emerson draws a distinction between the self, what he calls the me, that which is external to the self in nature, the not me, and the mixture of human will with nature that is used to create art. So he says all that is separate from us, all which philosophy distinguishes as the not me that is both nature and art, all other men and my own body must be ranked under this name, nature. Everything is contained within nature. We're going to see this idea again and again in antebellum literature. When we get to Walt Whitman, watch for this, because we're going to see how this kind of like all is one, all is connected, that theme pops up over and over again. So let's take a look at one other passage from Nature here. This is from a chapter called Discipline. Again, pause the video for a moment if you'd like to read through the quote. Now, this passage really highlights the degree to which Emerson believed that the human will could transform nature. Nature fuels human creation and in turn becomes the double of man, right? He says it is made to serve. It offers all its kingdoms to man as the raw material which he may mold into what is useful. Man is never weary of working it up. He forgoes the subtle and delicate air into wise and melodious words and gives them wing as angels of persuasion and command. So for Emerson, nature is really the touchstone. Nature is where the muses get their ideas. It's how you create art through nature. So just like in the quote on the previous slide where Emerson spoke of the mixture of human will with nature, in this passage, the language is a little different. It's more about the imposition of the human will upon the natural world rather than a mixture. And here, nature is made to serve. It's persuasion. It's a realized will. So finally, I do want to kind of go briefly over one other idea in nature. There we go. It's unity. And in this, we see a few other of Emerson's important themes. So in the first of these two statements, we see Emerson attempting to articulate the unity of all things. And this is one of the primary tenets of Transcendentalism, and we're going to see this theme again and again, especially in Walt Whitman's poetry. Specifically, Emerson is saying that the world, indeed the universe, in all of its vastness, is no more complete or complex than the most basic element of nature. A leaf, a drop, a crystal, a moment of time. This notion of the microcosm is really important to Emerson, and it's going to be important to other writers too. Here, Emerson is making an argument that we're going to see over and over again. The tiniest part of the world, in this case a leaf, contains the entirety of the whole universe. It's not a mistake then, and it's not random, that Whitman names one of his most famous collections of poems, Leaves of Grass. He literally takes a leaf of grass and contemplates the world through it. So here, Emerson shifts our focus. A raindrop is not small and insignificant. It's everything. Now, in the second of these statements, we see Emerson reaching suddenly for mutual common experience, for the everyday perceptions that everyone shares, in an effort to articulate a complex idea that we may fail to appreciate in the rush of our everyday lives. So here he's using the metaphor of a river, especially the image of someone tossing the stone and watching it kind of ripple outward, to suggest the influence of forces that may lie outside of our range of vision. So again, this is that implication that everything is connected, and even things that you aren't necessarily aware of seeing, just as you might not see somebody toss the stone into the river, you could see the later ripples that come from it. So this concept of the connection between and within all things will resonate throughout Emerson's other work that you're going to be reading, and we're going to see it in Whitman's, and we'll see it in some other places as well. So one other thing about nature that I want to bring up, just because it's such an important and really, really famous image, is that of the transparent eyeball. So one of Emerson's most memorable metaphors is the transparent eyeball. Please pause the video for a moment so you can read this passage. And as you do, consider what Emerson might have meant with this strange phrase. He probably didn't mean a giant eyeball wearing a top hat and legs. That was a satirical cartoon done later. So as you consider this, think about what it is about experiencing nature in the ways that Emerson describes that prompts him to say that all mean egotism vanishes. It sounds almost very kind of Far Eastern, like a Far Eastern religion, like Buddhism, where the I, the self kind of disappears and we are all one. So much of nature is concerned with the relationship between the me of the self and the not me of the natural world. But here, the me and the not me almost become a singular entity in this transparent eyeball that is both a self and is also consuming and a part of the world around it. As we've seen in the other sections of nature I've pulled out, Emerson's really concerned with the imposition of the human upon the natural world. But here, the human becomes nothing. The will becomes nothing. And there is a unity within nature that surpasses even the mixture of human will that he refers to elsewhere. So one of the readings you're assigned for this unit is portions of The American Scholar. I wanted you to read some of this work because it shows some of the transcendentalist ideas that will be even more clear and forceful in self-reliance. It also demonstrates that at this time, there are communities of writers and thinkers calling for something new in American letters and literature, something not reliant on or dependent upon traditions of the past. Emerson tells us that the scholar is or should be man thinking, but up until now, he hasn't seen it in America. America has not produced anyone to live up to this ideal. He hasn't produced anyone as great as the great poets or the great thinkers of the past. Instead, he says we need to change course because scholars should be influenced by three things: nature, history, and action. For the scholar, everything they need to know can be found in experiences of the natural world. Emerson critiques scholars who use books as instructions or depend upon them, rather than seeing them as examples of what people did in the past to create new ideas and to state new things. He laments the weak scholars who believe that they can hide themselves away in an ivory tower without actually going out and living. For him, action and experience is the only way to become man thinking. So on this slide, we see a few of the most important quotes that help to highlight the main ideas of the American Scholar. Notice how Emerson is interested in a future-facing scholar rather than a man dependent upon the past. The soul for Emerson, and we'll see this later in Whitman as well, is the one thing of value. The essence of the individual person is so much more important than anything else, but the soul cannot be mired in the past or constrained by false rules of society and politeness. Absolute truth is what the soul calls for. Finally, it is important to note as you read through The American Scholar that even though there were well-regarded and respected women in the Transcendentalist community, Emerson's language and his notion of the American Scholars is specifically masculine, one based in virility and courage rather than cowardice. So it does kind of make us ask the question of who counts here in Emerson's America. Other than nature, self-reliance is perhaps Emerson's best-known piece, so we'll finish up with self-reliance. This famous essay is the blueprint for the kind of individualistic spirit that's often seen as a hallmark of American character. In self-reliance, Emerson makes a forceful argument that men are at their best when they're self-reliant. The essay contains the most thorough statement of one of his recurrent themes, the need for each person to avoid conformity and false consistency and follow his or her own instincts and ideas. He says, and these are some of the most important and famous quotes that you're going to see. He says, to believe your own thoughts, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is to be true for all men, that is genius. So again, it's this idea that we are all connected. We are all one. What is true for one man is true for all. We're going to see this again in Walt Whitman when he says the experience of everyone is the same, whether it is the enslaved man or the suicide or the mother or anyone, it's all one. And understanding that is true genius. He says, society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members to surrender liberty and culture of the either. The virtue in most request is conformity. Self-reliance is aversion. It loves not realities and creators, but names and customs. So here again, we get a little bit of that kind of masculine-oriented idea of like society being against manhood. One of his really famous lines, to be great is to be misunderstood. He lists great thinkers of the past, many of whom ended up as martyrs for their beliefs. And he says to be great is to be misunderstood. A true scholar doesn't worry about being understood. He worries about being truthful. Another really important and famous quote says, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosopher and divines. So this idea that you always have to be the same. Right? He has a metaphor of the sailing ship and how it has to tack back and forward and do a zigzag to kind of make a straight line. And he says that men should be able to do the same thing. You should be able to change your mind. Finally, he says, nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principles. So as we consider Emerson's work and as you dive into his readings, remember that he is hugely important, especially in antebellum America, and his influence is going to be felt in American literature for quite some time. This is in part because he was part of a thriving and vibrant intellectual community in the Northeast. He is not alone. He is one of many authors who were all in conversation, literally and figuratively, with each other. He was at the center of one of the earliest philosophical schools of thought in American history. His work, Nature, served as a touchstone for those who came to call themselves transcendentalists. In his essay, The American Poet, Emerson specifically calls for a new kind of poetry and a new kind of poet, one not beholden to the past. His descriptions of poetry that does not bow down or conform to meter seem to almost be summoning Walt Whitman, who we will see has an extraordinary impact on poetry, not only in America, but throughout the world. Now, Transcendentalism might be linked to European Romanticism, but in Emerson and his fellow writers, it takes on a distinctly American air. The notions of individuality and personal liberty echo some of the founding ideas of the nation. And they were in many ways the beginning of many of the aspects of what we now see as American identity. Now, I will warn you, Emerson can be a bit tricky to read. His prose is dense and often twisting. He can feel very repetitive and sometimes very obtuse because of the language he uses, but don't worry about getting everything. Read Emerson for what you can get. What you'll find is that you're likely going to struggle through a paragraph only to trip over a line that feels strangely modern and reads crystal clear. Read for those moments where Emerson sounds almost like one of our contemporaries, calling for us to be true to ourselves, to be present in nature and the world around us, and to understand the connection in all things. So I hope you enjoy some of Emerson, and if you don't enjoy it, I hope you survive some of Emerson. As always, if you have questions, if you want to talk about any of these ideas or texts, feel free to reach out. I'm always available during student hours by email or through the Canvas website.